So this session is about collaborative API governance, and really about if you can get that big feedback loop functioning well, because that's what API governance is. It's a big feedback loop wrapped around the API lifecycle. Then it sets you up to support and enable adoption and innovation within the fintech sector, and especially within your organizations that are working in finance. So my name is Frank Kilcommons. I'm an API technical evangelist at SmartBear. Before moving to the tooling side of the house, I spent many years as an engineer and architect within financial services. Delighted to be joined by Arnab Mitra this morning, who is Program Manager for BIAN, the Banking Industry Architecture Network. The structure of this talk is we're going to look at how the financial landscape has changed, the impact that that has had on APIs. We'll then shift to see why human collaboration is such a critical ingredient for decentralized governance, and how the role of human stakeholders, API specifications, and tooling can come together, really help instill quality in your API delivery, and effectively make sure that you can be more successful. And then with that kind of foundation in place, we'll look at how BIAN can come in as an industry accelerator and have the blueprints for you to really tackle being a more composable finance organization. So kind of setting the scene, and this is a very high-level slide about kind of what has changed specifically within the retail banking sector. So if we look at how value has been delivered there now, we have situations where we really have enabled scale. So we have thousands of banks, we have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of fintechs, and of course we've billions of end users. And that value exchange has changed. So it's moved from a situation where those traditional institutions would have had, a dogmatic control over the end-to-end user experience. And now they have to focus on exposing their capabilities into an embedded world. And then we will have the fintechs coming along, taking those capabilities, putting them together in a more customized, tailored end-user experience, and making that available for consumers, or for end users, should I say. And end user expectations have really, really increased. So the financial products that we're making available to them will be critiqued to the same standard that they're getting across the best digital experiences across their professional or personal lives. So looking at what's happening kind of as these new business models are coming about, the technical architecture is also changing within organizations. So we're seeing the rise of APIs. There's more and more APIs being created as we're all moving from monolithic architectures into more composable, capability-focused architectures where microservices play a big role. And we hear microservices everywhere. And if you're into hype cycles that are produced by some of the analyst organizations, you'll see that microservices have left the throat of disillusionment. So they really are everywhere. We run annual surveys every year at SmartBear, and microservices are being identified year on year as the catalyst for continued API growth. And the complexity within this landscape is also changing. So the modern day integration landscape is a melting pot of different API styles. It's not just REST, it's not just SOAP, it's not just event-driven. They're all coming together. And in fact, over 60% of organizations are using 3 or more styles or protocols of APIs in their day-to-day interactions with their customers. But it's not just about having APIs. So if we convert to a microservices architecture, if we're able to participate in these new marketplaces that are there, is that enough? Well, absolutely not. So just having APIs is not enough. Having APIs is table stakes for every organization right now. So what we need to focus on is how can we have good APIs? And I think this is one of the things that came up in some of the keynotes earlier. So an API in itself, if it's not being consumed, generates zero value. That's a fact. So you need to focus on delivering good APIs to help you stand out from your competitors. What is a good API? Well, it's one that's useful, it's one that's usable, and it's one that's discoverable. So you need to be able to find it. It needs to be able to help you address the problem that you're trying to solve from an API consumer perspective. But with all of, and that might sound a little bit trivial, but with all of the APIs that exist within our organization, with the increasing complexity, and also with the heightened consumer demands, standardization is becoming a big challenge. And again, this is something that we really, really see every year on our side in our State of API surveys. Standardization is the #1 challenge that practitioners want to see solved across the organization. And of course, without standardization, API delivery approaches become very fragmented and bespoke. So the the work becomes harder on the provider side, it becomes harder on the consumer side. That causes costs to increase, it causes your time to market to become delayed, and it just weakens the value proposition that you're having. And over time, that will hinder your adoption, and it can even hinder your future viability as an organization, because no one can participate with you. So when I look at how can we address the standardization problem, how can we have an effective governance to improve our API delivery that isn't too restricting, that's really moving towards a decentralized model, and I always focus on two simple questions, and that's, are we building the right API? So that means we need to have stakeholders, different personas coming in, giving us fast feedback loops to determine, are we solving and tackling the problem in the right way for the consumers of the API that we're about to build? And then, are we building the API right? And that means, can we have the verification into the process, so the codified verification, to determine that we're delivering this API very, very similarly to other APIs that might exist in our organization? And from a regulatory perspective, are we also able to deliver it in a way that meets the regulatory requirements that are being put upon us? And to kind of address this first question, we need to make sure that we understand that APIs are not just a technical artifact. So they have moved into the domain of the business with how value is being exchanged in financial services, and APIs is the conduit of that value. So if you're participating in platforms, ecosystems, other marketplaces that you don't control, it's the API that brings your core business value proposition into that location. So you need to make sure that you have the right humans participating in the process, and this is really all about human collaborative governance. So you need to make sure you have the program managers talking to the API designers. You need to make sure you're getting feedback from the API consumers. You need to make sure that you're getting inputs from architects, from legal, from information security. You need to make sure that the developers who have to abide by these governance standards aren't being suffocated by them. So you need to make sure that you can prove that there's value into this process. And of course, if you're bringing your value proposition into another market, you need to make sure that marketing will support from a go-to-market perspective as well. Then, of course, you want automation. So you want to be able to verify and provide the feedback of those codified automated verifications back into your process, and then stand all of this on top of 4 pillars. And this is kind of crucial from a financial services perspective. So we want interoperability. We need to be able to talk to everything else, especially in the world of embedded finance. But it goes beyond the communication technology. We need to be able to functionally interoperate. So if we're dealing with a payee, for example, I see Neil here from Swift. So if you're talking about a payee, then a payee needs to be a payee everywhere. You don't want different parties inventing their own structure and definition for what that entity represents. You also need consistency. So as a provider, if I'm putting data out there, I need to be sure and confident it's going to be consumed consistently. On the flip side, as a consumer, I need to make sure there's consistency at the API provider side. So if I'm consuming one API here and another API here, I expect the same onboarding experience. I expect errors to be handled in the same way. I expect pagination to be handled in the same way, and so forth. And then fluidity is really important. So as you're moving into that composable architecture model, you need to be able to adjust to market conditions. So we heard the term about Lego building blocks a little bit earlier, but that's really what it's all about, making sure that we can adjust to market conditions and participate in new business models as they come up. And there's plenty of examples out there. I think Uber Eats is a very good one. So they had an API for maps. They had an API to find drivers. They had an API to take payments. So all they needed to do to create a new business model was find out how to consume existing APIs with regards to food menus and place that into their overarching experience. So that's kind of the human angle. When we then think about the codified verification, then this is where we should be betting on API specifications. So this gives us very standard ways to take that human signed off design and put it into a process that allows us to do multiple things in parallel. So we can start on the implementation, we can start on testing, we can start on working on documentation, and you would have heard Mark talk about the importance of DX and developer experience. But because we're all focusing around that single source of truth, which has been verified and validated from a human perspective, now we can do the codified verification on it. And it allows us to shift a lot of that governance further left on the process and reduce our dependability on API gateways and API management tooling. Because if you're leaving all of the governance to the API management side, you're really asking for problems. Because if we listen to what Gartner will also tell us, it's that by 2025, less than 50% of enterprise APIs will actually be managed by API management tooling. So we need to find a way to get governance earlier into the process. Now, talking about tools that can help, and there's plenty of tools out there, Swagger Hub is just an example of this, but it acts as that discoverable catalog. So it can support OpenAPI, it can support async API, irrespective of what phase an API is in its life cycle. So you can discover it. You can help promote reusability of this thing that we've already delivered within the enterprise. We then have domains, and these are the real way that we can reuse components right across the landscape. So you can have those at different levels. You can also take them from an industry standard like BIAN or like Swift, and you don't have to reinvent the model. You then have custom rules, of course, that's your linting, that's your codified validation and verification. And often, unfortunately, governance gets boiled down to linting. And linting is just one little part of overarching governance. And then templates. So this is a way where you can enforce standards at your capability or at your department level. And you can say every API to be delivered in this domain will look like this. So you let your designers start with a pre-filled template. They never should have to start with a blank sheet of paper. And then automation is crucial. So can you generate the reports to prove and verify that you're being compliant across all distributed teams and even at a higher level from a regulatory and audit perspective? And I think if you have this foundation in place, then you can look to really accelerate your governance with functional blueprints for how you can do this at scale. And then I think this is where Arnab will take over from a buy-in perspective and take this to the next level. So welcome, Arnab.
Thank you, Frank. My voice is a bit gone, but I'll try to be as audible as possible. Okay, are we seeing things? Okay, yeah, we are. Right, so on the left-hand side, we have what we are talking about in terms of open banking. So open banking with the regulatory initiatives, what we had was things like PSD2, OBIE in the UK, the Berlin Group in Germany and so on, CDR in Australia, FTX in the US and so on. But their functional coverage was mostly around accounts, around balances, initiating payments, so retail banking focused stuff really. Now with BIAN as a standard, and I'm talking about BIAN here, it gives you the functional blueprint across the banking landscape. So you have some examples on the right around, let's say, customer onboarding, mortgage underwriting, handling windfall investments for investment management and things like this. So really BIAN, what it's trying to do is give you a picture across the banking landscape. Now, the next slide, the key message here is on the left, you see the monolithic banking model of the past, and maybe some of this has changed now and is changing now. And on the right, you see the composable architecture, the little building blocks, the reusable building blocks. And if we do those building blocks in a standardized way, then we can connect across multiple banks, across multiple fintechs, across the board, within and without, outside the bank. So that's the idea. So in trying to address that, what BIAN did was, with its members, come up with what we call the bank on a page view. It's an extremely complex diagram. It's not readable, but the point here really is that you can have these little rectangular building blocks there, which we call service domains, and they are the functional blueprint by combining which you can address any functionality within a bank. So it could be payment initiation, current account, investment portfolio management, whatever. So with that in mind, we go on to the next slide. So you see here, we take a use case of corporate customer onboarding. And basically, it is a generic use case, really. And what we're trying to show here is the steps that are involved. So on the very top, you see things like register party, execute, analyze onboarding requests, then do things like KYC, KYB, PEP checks, and so on and so forth. And then on the next level, you see those rectangular building blocks from our complex diagram. They are the service domains. You have, I'm trying to read them here. You have things like party data management, party lifecycle management, party as in customer, and so on. So what we are saying is, if you use these building blocks as APIs, let's say. Then what you could do is you could reduce things like vendor lock-in. So, you could put in, fintechs like DueDil, like Onfido for doing KYC, KYB type stuff, or you could swap them out when you wanted to. You could have your own in-house thing or outsource it to someone else. So this black layer that we saw in one of the previous presentations, the first presentation, where you're trying to build a composable architecture, this is the blueprint in banking terms, what Bayern gives to you. And you can use your own AI models in that and all sorts of things like that. Key point is you can plug and play. Sorry, I'll try to move. This next slide shows you some detailed Bayern artifacts. We don't need to go into all the details of that, but on the left-hand top, you see one where we have a sequence diagram. It shows how those building blocks can work with each other to achieve something, in this case, customer onboarding. And then it also shows how that translates to the right-hand side to API endpoints. So Bayern gives you the business scenarios, the sample business scenarios, and it shows you how we have API endpoints to relate to that. And these APIs are, could be implemented by banks, by tech, to offer different services, financial services, for instance. And today, we have many members across the board, HSBC being the big one here, Santander, JP Morgan Chase in the US, Citi, and so on, who are using our models to do this sort of thing that I'm talking about, the composable banking parts of it. The next slide shows some of the Bayern artifacts. We have spoken about some of these. We have spoken about APIs. We have spoken about the sequence diagrams, the business scenarios. We also have a business object model, which is quite detailed. So those little building blocks you saw in the beginning, the service domains, they obviously have a lot of attributes within them. They have operations within them. The operations translate to API endpoints. So these things are kind of detailed in the Bayern model, and each of these attributes, they have their data types and so on. So all of that is there in the Bayern model. The next slide, again, is a complex one, and I won't go into all the details of it, but it is our CI/CD pipeline. So Bayern is a member-driven organization. It's very small, and therefore we don't have people to do things. So we must automate everything. So everything is pretty much automated for us, apart from the start of it, where the content is generated by our members. So we have on the left our biz design repository, which is our architecture repository. Then in number one, then to two, we push all of our models into MongoDB, into the cloud. And then in three, you have REST APIs, which, with Swagger Hub interfaces, which lets you access this data and post feedback back into the model. And then on the top, in three above, you have our API representations of our service domains of our model, all auto-generated and presented to the external world. And finally, in 8 down below, you have a feedback process where any feedback from the outside world comes back into the Bayern model. The key point here is number 7 in terms of our talk, where we have a governance step. If I show you this next screen, what happens is on the right-hand side, an account recovery, by the way, is a service domain. It's one of those rectangles in our first complex diagram. So let's say we have some feedback from the outside world. I've taken a sample bank here, bank B, on the right-hand side. Then on the left-hand side, we can compare this feedback with the Bayern model. We see 2 attributes have been added, and then we might choose to add it to the Bayern model or not add it. So we have that kind of governance. Our members, which consists of banks and tech, they approve and reject this kind of feedback into the Bayern model. So finally, to give you a picture of how Bayern does things, on the top, we have a lot of user interactable tools meant for human beings to use. So, things like API portals, things like, portals displaying other things, our certification app and so on, GitHub repositories with REST APIs and so on, OS3 definitions. And then below the glass, we have the REST API layer, where all of the functionality that we present through the user interface, the web, is available through API. So what we're saying, and a lot of our members want this, they want to integrate the Bayern model into their own tools. They don't want to go through our human interactable tools. And we give all the model through our tools. And just a point on Bayern, Bayern is a not-for-profit organization, so it's membership-driven, and the idea is to standardize the banking industry integration challenges, really, through the composable framework. I think I finished there.
Yeah, great.
That was
Any
excellent
questions?
on time. Any questions? And if you can repeat back the questions,
Yeah,
Mr. Allen,
of course.
please.
Do you think, I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen around API governance is either to fulfill, for example, regulatory requirements, GDPR, PII, HIPAA, whatever. People go away and just redesign the same API to deliver the same resource in a slightly different manner each time. So I can't put social security number in, for example, if I'm crossing a geographic boundary. What are sort of you guys looking at to be able to do this, to drive that ability to form, change a resource according to a context it's being delivered in? It's sort of one of those areas I was thinking about, sort of elephant in the room that never gets discussed around governance.
Yeah, so just to repeat the question is how do we deal with kind of reusing and not reinventing the wheel on different models, and if we're moving into jurisdictions, how can we kind of benefit from having a common core and then maybe a customization when required. That's being addressed at a few different areas. So from a core specification perspective, let's say in Open API and Async API, specifically more in JSON schema, because we're all evolving towards using the same version of JSON schema and supporting additional JSON schema dialects to make polymorphism and composing models easier. So that's one of the things. From a tooling perspective, we're then making sure that, number one, we can build out support for that to make it easier for the people who are creating these models, and making sure that it's easy to reuse these models and being able to observe where they are being used. So for example, if you're drafting an API, then it should be very easy for you to reference and get suggestions about potentially this is the domain model you should use in this instance. You shouldn't go off and reuse it. And that's kind of where a lot of the automated reports with regards to auditability can really help. So you can see where domains are being used, what capabilities you expect those domains to be used in, and then if someone is stepping outside of that boundary. I think from a buy-in perspective, they're really trying to kind of set the blueprint for these are the models that make sense. So before starting to reinvent your own one, see if you can reuse this, which is more of a industry standard agnostic across different banks and organizations, so that we can improve the interoperability in the marketplaces where we all need to come together. Does that help answer? Kind of. Yeah, we can talk in more detail. It's a detailed subject. Anything you'd like to add to that, Arnab?
No, I think that's good.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.